Hi, this is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. On this episode, we're looking at Dick Tracy for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I'm going to start off with a personal anecdote. Not to just talk about myself, but to illustrate my lack of nostalgic bias for this game. Let's set the stage. It was the summer of 1990, and Dick Tracy was everywhere. Disney's marketing department was working overtime to promote the movie, hoping it would see the overwhelming success Batman had the previous summer. I was a 7-year-old boy, the prime target demographic for this campaign, and thanks to my lifelong love of the 30s, I bought into it. Hard. Comics, toys, posters, the soundtrack, reprints of the original newspaper strips. I wound up gaining a massive appreciation for the character and his history. So, when I was at Jumbo Video with my mom and discovered that there was a Dick Tracy NES game, remember, the internet wasn't a thing, I had to play it. We rented it that weekend, and I excitedly popped it into my NES as soon as I got home. I was greeted with the title screen, which presented a decent approximation of not just the silhouette logo from the movie poster, but also the scene from the movie where Flat Top machine guns Tracy's name into a brick wall. I started the game, read the first clue, checked which criminal was the best suspect, and hit the streets. And promptly got gunned down on said streets. I couldn't figure out how to stop the snipers from shooting me, and I had no instructions to guide me. The game rental didn't come with the proper manual. Instead, it came with this guy. This is a permastruct instruction sheet. These would be stuck to the inside of rental cases because video rental places would regularly deal with lost or stolen official manuals, and you couldn't do that with these. They were, more often than not, practically useless, but they were there. Which is something, I guess? Such was the case here. Okay, so after figuring out on my own that the select button allowed me to get out of the car and shoot at the snipers, I picked up on the street naming system and made it to my first investigation scene, at which point I got stuck again. I could not figure out how to enter the building. Nothing seemed to be working, and the permastruct manual was, unsurprisingly, no help whatsoever. So there I was, stuck outside the building with no help and no way to progress in the game. That was it. That was my entire experience with Dick Tracy. I knew that there were side-scrolling sections in the game because they were shown on the back of the box, but I never got to see them. I was infuriated because I'd been so excited for that game. We took it back to the rental store that day, complained, and got a different game rental instead. It wouldn't be until the late 90s, when stores were selling used NES games, 3 for $10, and yeah, I'm not making that up, that I would encounter Dick Tracy again, and finally figure out how to play it. My problem all those years ago had been with the placement of my car. It was blocking the entrance, and I had no way of knowing. Now, here's the thing. Figuring out how to play it, I realized what the game was attempting to do, and came to appreciate the attempt, if not the execution. First, the NES game was not the only Dick Tracy game to be released. There were games for the Game Boy, Sega Master System, Genesis, and MS-DOS. The last of which was produced by Titus of Superman 64 fame. From what I can tell, and in contradiction to the Wikipedia page on the subject, the DOS game is just a worse remake of the NES game. The others, though, were simple run-and-gun arcade-style shooters. There's little to distinguish Dick Tracy on the Genesis and Master System from, say, The Punisher in his NES game. The Game Boy game takes the side-scrolling sections of the NES game and strips them of any context. Yeah, you collect clues in the form of photo fragments, but that is the closest to actual detective work that the player is tasked with. The Dick Tracy NES game is different in multiple ways, however, and is, surprisingly, better for it. First, the goal of the game is not to simply gun down as many people on screen as possible. Dick Tracy is a detective, which means that so is the player. You need to solve crimes, not just, well, commit them via wholesale murder. This means gathering clues, following the evidence, and arresting the correct suspect. Evidence is key here as well. Sure, if you know ahead of time who the culprit for a particular case is, you can head right over and try to arrest him. And spoiler, the criminal is always a guy. Breathless Mahoney's only crime is not looking anything like Madonna. Or being played by Madonna, depending on your perspective. But without evidence to back up that arrest, he'll be out of jail and you'll be berated by Police Chief Brandon. You need to actually think like a cop to succeed. This is not to say that there is no gunplay in NES Dick Tracy. Far from it. Even here, though, the game makes the player behave not just like a cop, but a semi-responsible one. If a thug is shooting at you, and you respond in kind, that's fine. You're simply defending yourself. If an assailant comes at you fists flying and you shoot him, however, you get penalized. Some of your very limited health bar is taken away as a result of you using excessive force. You also don't get the unlimited bullets of the Dick Tracy games on other systems. This game wants you to be aware of each bullet you use, even if it's justified. What's more, the environment comes into play during the action as well. Bad guys can take cover behind furniture, crates, and so on, forcing you to move around these obstacles in order to stop them. Yes, this is a cover-based shooter, 15 years before they became the norm. I did say semi-responsible because Dick Tracy is still being characterized as a two-fisted detective. You either knock thugs out or gun them down. The only arrests you make in the game come from interrogation scenes. Tied to this, Tracy's Super Punch power-up doesn't carry the weight of the other fighting options in the game, but is an interesting interpretation of some of the hyperbole from the movie. The scene where Tracy throws a single punch and knocks out a group of mobsters, for example. This move sends the thug it connects with spinning across the screen, taking out any other thugs he comes into contact with. If you can keep the screen scrolling enough, you can take massive advantage of this in a gameplay sense. Tracy is still a comic strip character after all, and while not in the least realistic, it does offer perspective on the comic realism of the original strip and the movie. On that note, the game does offer enough tie-ins to the movie to justify calling it a movie-based game. Climbing up poles like the Club Ritz scene in the movie? Check. Escaping boiler rooms? Check. Hotels like the one Tracy gets framed in? Check. The docks where Tracy and Breathless meet? Check. All of these aspects of the movie are included, but are represented as recurring game mechanics rather than one-time set pieces. The game is more interested in giving the player the feel of the world created by the movie, rather than a one-to-one recreation of the movie's events, which I can appreciate. Even the dialogue scenes offer the same, not quite from the movie, but of the movie style, with Breathless constantly flirting with Tracy, while Big Boy plays innocent, but with a threatening tone. The game also goes above and beyond the movie, surprisingly fixing two of the sins committed by the film it was based off of. It would not be out of line to say that there were perhaps too many characters crammed into the film. So much so that many of the more unique villains were reduced to generic gangster figures, just with grotesque appearances. For example, the opening scene casually wipes out 5 characters who could have been main villains in their own right, given the chance. The game, however, in trying to promote the characters in the movie, reasserts the personalities and idiosyncrasies of the individual mobsters and villains. The Brow, for example, rather than simply being a henchman who is gunned down with little context, is described as a spy and saboteur in the game's mug sheet, and the clues point toward this. Likewise, Influence, rather than being just a visually interesting background character, is given back his interest and expertise in hypnosis, just as during his appearance in the original comic strip. Not every character gets a prominent role, but they are given more personality than the majority of them receive in the film. Tied to this, the film had enough interesting characters present for something like 6 films worth of storylines, if they had been utilized properly. Since the game doesn't have a specific runtime it needs to adhere to, it can build to the confrontation with Big Boy without glossing over the crimes or detective work involved in dismantling his organization. There are 5 cases overall in the game, and, on the surface, they don't seem to have anything in common. Taken as a whole, though, it shows the methodical way in which the police would have to approach taking down an organized crime syndicate in a large city, one operation at a time. You as a player move up the ranks of Big Boy's subordinates, imprisoning them for crimes you can prove they've committed, until you are able to properly go after the head of the mob, Big Boy himself, who is also the only arrestable criminal to actively fight back, which makes sense because he is the end boss of the game. Or really, the only boss in the game. The upside of this is that those same characters who are given their personalities back also get their day in the sun in terms of narrative, as they become suspects or perpetrators in individual stories in their own right, while still contributing to an overarching narrative, instead of remaining as background characters or nondescript henchmen. At this point, let's be clear about something. So far, it seems like I'm gushing about this game, making it sound like an underrated gem. I am gushing about the concepts in the game. Actually playing Dick Tracy is a chore. There's a reason it's such an internet punching bag. Minute to minute, there are numerous flaws in the gameplay. In the side-scrolling sections, hitboxes for both Tracy and the Thugsy fights are often awkwardly defined. The platform jumping is woefully inaccurate yet absolutely necessary, which is especially frustrating on the piers. Using the first aid kit is unnecessarily complicated. You need to hit select and B almost, but not quite simultaneously. And the placement of gunmen and their rate of fire in the later cases becomes blatantly unfair. I am not ashamed to say that I took full advantage of save state spamming in order to capture footage of the later levels, because look at this. As for the driving segments, the criticisms aren't necessarily what you'd expect. Yeah, the snipers are a royal pain, but here's the thing. Once you shoot them, they don't respawn. At all. For the rest of the game. If you spend the first case or two methodically eliminating them as you go, you can drive through the city in the later cases almost without incident. I say almost because there are still other cars to contend with, and they seem to be oblivious to your existence, despite the fact that you're driving a police car with the lights constantly flashing. This combined with the game absolutely refusing to let you drive outside of the proper lane, which, yeah, you're keeping to the lawful lanes like a proper officer of the law, but you also have your lights going, which should legally provide some leeway, means that you will take damage while driving, which should have been avoidable. Being forced to stay in the proper lane is also a problem in the car chase segments, since that means that you simply cannot dodge the gunfire coming from the car you're chasing. No swerving, no sudden turns, you're stuck taking that damage. There's also no indication of how close you are to causing the suspect vehicle to come crashing to a stop, and running into the vehicle while it is spinning out will still damage you, again making these segments unnecessarily punishing. I did find a few little tricks to make managing the game a little easier. Things that, again, were never mentioned in the Permastruct manual. First, if you're on the streets and running low on health or handgun bullets, go to your nearest police station. All of your handgun bullets will be restored, along with some of your health. This health trick has its limit though. If you are at 3 full badges or more, visiting the police station won't refill anymore. Also, if you find a location that has a particularly useful item, and don't mind taking your time, the items repopulate each time you go into that location. I used this to get the 5 maximum first aid kits from the pier in the 4th case, especially since falling in the water sends you back to the streets instead of killing you. None of this mitigates how straight up broken the final confrontation against Big Boy is, though. Not only does Big Boy have a ridiculous rate of fire, but he's hiding behind several pieces of cover. You either take some hits trying to get close to him, or you hit furniture instead of him. I tried creeping forward so that he appears on screen but doesn't start firing, which is a tactic that works for other gun-toting enemies in the game. It worked in that he didn't start firing at me, but after taking 4 shots, no matter what I did, the game would instantly kill me for some reason. This is another instance where I will absolutely admit to using save states, because of how broken the fight is. Eventually, I managed to luck into a position where, not wanting to risk using the gun, I could punch at him without him hurting me, which allowed me to actually defeat him, as you see here. This came after try, after try, after try, after try. I honestly do not know how anyone was able to beat this game back when it came out. Mind you, I also don't personally know anyone who has had the patience to beat this game, period. Dick Tracy for the NES is definitely not an underappreciated, underrated gem. On the other hand, it isn't a complete disaster on the level of something like Action 52 or Back to the Future. It's a game with several interesting premises and gameplay systems, which feels like it was rushed to market to coincide with the theatrical run of the film whose license it bears. So, you know, a typical licensed NES game. The potential present in Dick Tracy is clearly visible. It just feels like the ideas on offer wouldn't be realized for another 21 years, until the release of L.A. Noire, despite that game's, let's be generous and call it, troubled development cycle. If you have the patience to handle the minute-to-minute gameplay, then I would still recommend giving Dick Tracy a play to check out the potential for what could have been. Once you know what the game expects of the player and what it's trying to accomplish, it makes for a good weekend rental.